Consciousness and the Acquisition of Language by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Chapter 1. The Psychological Development of Language in the Child. Section 1, an overview. During the first months of life, the child cries, he makes expressive movements, and then he begins to babble. One must consider this babbling as the ancestor of language. It is, above all, extraordinarily rich and includes phonemes which do not exist in the language that is spoken around the child, and which he himself, once he has become an adult, is incapable of reproducing. For example, when he wants to reacquire them to learn a foreign language. This babbling is therefore a polymorphic language, which is spontaneous with respect to its environment. It exists in deaf-mute children, even though it is not as well developed. There is, however, a large amount of imitation. This imitation reaches its culmination around 6 to 12 months, but it remains rudimentary to the extent that the child does not grasp the meaning of that which he is imitating. The same relation exists between babbling and language as between scribbling and drawing. This imitation concerns the melody of the sentence just as much as the words, because the child tries, as it were, to speak in general. As W. Stern relates, that for a month his daughter spoke a foreign language which had a conversational tone but which did not mean anything. It was as though she was playing at speaking. According to Delacroix, the child bathes in language. He is attracted and enthralled by the movements of dialogue around him and tries it himself. Language is the indissoluble extension of all physical activity, and at the same time, it is quite new in relation to that physical activity. Speech emerges from the total language as constituted by gestures, mimicry, etc. But speech transforms. Already it uses the organs of phonation for a function that is unnatural to them. In effect, language has no organs. All the organs that contribute to language already have their function. Language introduces itself as a superstructure, that is, as a phenomenon that is already a witness to another order. The problem is to know how it has passed from a quasi-biological activity to one which is non-biological, but which, nevertheless, presupposes a whole movement or activity that has integrated it into dialogue. In the ensuing period, from 9 to 18 months, 15 months on average, spoken language begins. First, the child knows how to say a few words. Then there is a kind of stagnation. Prayer's son continued for 6 months with only 2 words, and Stern's son for 2 months with 1 single word. In a less precise fashion, this phenomena occurs in most children, for language has a kind of incubation period. The acquisition of language during the first year. The first weeks. A young child's facial expressions are quite precocious. Gregoire indicates that the nursing infant, up to the end of the second month, laughs and smiles not only to demonstrate its satisfaction, but also to answer to the smile of those around him. This already presupposes a relationship with others, which precedes the language that will appear in this context. This is why it is artificial to consider the first words as spontaneous, long before they appeared, there had been attitudinal responses. Gregoire emphasizes the fact that intellectual activity of the nursing infant is much more important than we think. We have a tendency to underestimate it, since it is not accompanied by any external manifestations. Yet from birth, there is a capacity for relating to the external world that does not stop growing during the first weeks of life. One can even stimulate conditioned reflexes in the embryo, and from the moment of birth, the brain records specific changes according in the immediate environment. The ability to mimic is considerably enhanced during the first week, as is hearing and vision. A child from 4 to 7 days old hears 1.5 times better than a child from 0 to 3 days old. Premature children have a normal intellectual development, for they are able to overcome the physical handicap that they had at birth. Babbling. 2.5 months. From 2.5 months on, babbling appears. It is formed principally with the consonants L and R, whose acquisition cannot be explained in terms of imitation. These vocal utterances seem to be common to all babies, independent of the language around them. One could explain the use of these phenomena from a physiological point of view by showing that the predominance of sucking activity favors the appearance of labal and guttural consonants. It seems untenable to claim that the babbling of the first period is the result of imitation. Some writers believe it has to do with the imitation of lip movement, but P. Gilwam has shown that children imitate gutturals which cannot be seen on the lips of the person speaking. If there is any influence from the environment, it is hearing and not from vision that evokes the imitation. Moreover, children fix not upon the mouth, but rather on the eyes of the person speaking. It has often been noted that children open their mouth when they are listening to someone speak, but Gregoire claims that this has to do with the contagiousness of the other person's behavior, like yawning, and not with the effort to reconstruct that which has been seen. But the presence of the adult's language stimulates, excites the child in a general way. From his waking moments, the child hears someone speaking. Most of the time, language is addressed to him directly, and this acoustic sensation provokes the stimulation first of his limbs and then of the phonatory organs, assimilable by the limbs. In conclusion, the child receives the sense of language from his environment. Imitation plays absolutely no part at this stage. However, one must emphasize the importance of the child's involvement in the mode of speech of his environment, i.e., rhythm and pitch, etc., the effects of which is a general attraction to language. Again, remember Delacroix's statement, the child bathes in language. Wundt says that the development of language is always a premature development. In fact, it is impossible to deny a kind of spontaneity, but the child's relationship with his environment is what points him towards language. It is not a development towards an end defined by the environment and not pre-established in the organism. 4 months. From 4 to 10 months, according to Gregoire, an important linguistic and intellectual development takes place. However, we are less aware of it because we are much more attuned to the progress of motor activity. What is the significance of sound uttered during this period? The child lingers at certain sounds and modulates them. varying their accent and duration, all of which can be translated into variations of energy and disposition. From this moment on, certain appreciable nuances drawn from the speech of adults begin to appear. Buhler, in his Theory of Language, has observed that German children initially place the tonic accent at the second syllable of their vocal utterance, but quickly shift it to the first syllable. They take on, as it were, the German accent. Thus, even before speaking, the child appropriates the rhythm and stress, the accentuation of his own language. About this time, children achieve vocal utterances of an extraordinary richness, emitting sounds that they will be incapable of reproducing later. There will be a selection, a kind of impoverishment. 7 months. Around 7 months, the free babbling seems to be transformed little by little into a voluntary effort to speak. The child is still far from articulated speech, but he does not make some attempts at pronunciation, and he becomes more and more sensitive to what he hears. It is as if his intention to speak has become more and more definite. 8 months. In 8 months, the child can begin to repeat words when they are spoken to him with the expectation that he will repeat them. He introduces these words into a kind of sentence that is a kind of imitation of the sentence according to its rhythmic aspect. This is the pseudo-language. At 12 months, from the 10th to the 12th month, Gregoire noticed a polyphony of pseudo-words with an infinite number of variations. Also, around 12 months, his son amused himself by crying out loud, louder than his father. In this way, he became capable of creating quasi-linguistic effects. The first word. It is at this moment, writes Gregoire, that his son's first words appeared, a word designating the train which passed in front of his house. This was a particular word which gave a name to a single thing or a set of things, the train, the emotional released by its passing. Above all, it translated an affective state. The multiplicity of meanings was contained in the word sentence. It would be artificial to draw an absolute division between the first word and that which was there before. For a long time, the child had defined objects by his behavior. He simply did not make use of particular words. In Gregoire's case, we cannot say that the appearance of the first word implies a sudden consciousness of the sign-signified relation. In the Journal of Psychology article, Cassirer said that the first word allows for a synthesis of impressions and desperate facts. This presupposes that the word arrives as a summing up and a pruning down of a larger, unformulated richness of experience. For Gregoire, on the contrary, the experience prior to the word is poorer and less complete. For him, the word emerges as a unity. It is not a synthesis of prior experiences. Gregoire has attempted to show that the continuity of language development, on the one hand, there is the expression and definition of the object, even before the appearance of the first word. On the other hand, this appearance does not in any way put an end to the babbling, which, for a long time, accompanies the child's speech, and perhaps certain aspects of the adult's interior language, which is often not formulated, are no more than a continuation of the babbling. On the one hand, from the beginning of life, there are anticipations of what will become language. On the other hand, there is a persistence right up into adulthood of what was previously babbling. Meaning of the first word. First, the intellectualist interpretation. One is tempted to say with Delacroix that the sign is not really a signifier unless it is a mental sign. For that reason, it is necessary that connections be established between words and that a logical principle, a formal relation, regulate their relationship. The sign, therefore, will be part of the context, and its signification will depend on the context in which it is implicated. Delacroix and Stern seem to be in agreement on the importance of the first word. It reveals to the child that each thing has a name, and it accounts for his desire to learn these names. They hold that the appearance of the first word suddenly makes the relationship of the sign to the signified explicit. This conception bears largely on the famous example of Helen Keller, the deaf-mute girl, blind girl, whose teacher succeeded in re-educating her through the sense of touch. She relates in her autobiography that for a long time all efforts to give her a notion of the sign were in vain. But one day, when she was scooping up some water, at the moment that the contact of the cold water on her hand keenly impressed her, her teacher traced on her other hand the conventional sign designating water. At this instant, Helen Keller suddenly understood the sign-signified relationship, and within an hour, she had learned about 13 new signs. This example has encouraged the all-or-nothing view. Either one has consciousness and comprehension, or one has no language at all. 2. Critique of this view. Does the appearance of the first word signify the sudden consciousness of the signified relationship? There are several reasons why this seems to be difficult to accept. A. If this were the case, the child's first word would be followed by a rapid progress, as in Helen Keller's example. In fact, most of the time, it is followed by a long stagnation. How can we explain this stagnation in the first word if the first word really results in a sudden consciousness of the sign? B. Stern himself has admitted that the child is far from possessing a concept of the sign in the way that an adult understands it. For the adult, the sign is a convention. For the child, up to 6 or 7 years old, it is a property, a quality of the thing. For the child, the sign has a quasi-magical relationship, a relationship of participation, an intimate resemblance with the signified. Stern himself has related the example of a young child creation of words. This child, when questioned much later as to the reason for his creation, said, matter of fact, because the thing seemed to have that name. C. The child's first words are often distinct from adult words. Often they are uttered according to their automato-poetic value, hence the relationship through resemblance. But even if the child uses an adult word, the meaning is always more ephemeral. Often a single word would designate a group of things are applicable to similar situations. For example, music stands for music, military music, and soldiers. Neither in this case, nor when he seems to be using a metaphor, does the child make any generalizations. He lacks concepts for that. The child possesses a syncretic view of the situation, which allows him to assimilate things in a different order. Hence, if the word has such a slippery and confusing meaning for the child, we can no longer presume that he knows the sign in the same way that we do. In this case, its representation would be more coherent from the outset. However, the acquisition of the first word does mark a decisive step in the acquisition of language. In what way can we understand this phenomenon? Section 3, the acquisition of language in the first 5 years. Section A, 18 months to 3 years. During this period, the child directs his attention primarily towards a more and more perfect acquisition of his maternal tongue. The role of imitation predominates at this time, but it pertains only to the piecemeal textual production of the language spoken around him. One must distinguish between the immediate imitation and deferred imitation, where the model is incorporated into the child's latent knowledge and is not used until later. One famous example of deferred imitation is that of Stumpf's son. After having acquired several words and many natural symbols, automatopoeia, interjection, etc., he went on for 2 years without any increase in his vocabulary, manifesting a kind of passive resistance, a bad faith with respect to language, in spite of his nearly complete comprehension. At about 3 years and 3 months, he suddenly abandoned this attitude and immediately began speaking with ease. In this case, as in other less clear situations, we are talking about a true organization of imitated models and never of a pure and simple reception and reproduction. We will examine this problem of imitation further. Section B, after 3 years, we can distinguish other stages that follow. This seems difficult to do. Stern has distinguished the passing from word to sentence. However, this is not a very well-defined stage, since the first word always have a sentence value, even though the strict distinction is debatable. Other people distinguish different stages according to the growth of vocabulary and take stock of the child's linguistic knowledge at different ages. There have been a number of studies of this nature with disconcerting and always disappointing results. Duskadres evaluated the vocabulary of children at about 3.5 years, and on this basis established tests to avoid the necessity of repeating the evaluation each time. The results are varied. Stern found 300 words at 2 years, Delville 688, Major 142. What is the reason for this diversity of results? First, there is a lack of an exact definition of what must count as a word. Do 2 suffixes for one root count as 2 words or 1 word? The same for flexional endings. The working vocabulary of an adult, as well as a child, is much more limited than the vocabulary he understands or which he would know how to use if he really felt the necessity. Vendries has said that this virtual vocabulary is impossible to inventory. One cannot consider linguistic equipment as a summation of words. Rather, we must appeal to systems of variation that render an open series of words possible. This cannot be explored further here. It is a totality of open sectors with infinite possibilities of expression. Thus, when a child appropriates a new word for a word that he knows, must we count this as a new word? Yes and no, for we see that a word is truly a whole and not a summation. 5 years. Perhaps, as Piaget has suggested, one could introduce a new level of development after the age of 5. Up to that point, the child does not seek to communicate with others, dialogue, as much as to talk to himself, monologue. Speech as a mode of social communication does not gain importance until the child is 7 or 8 years old. In his experiments with kindergarten children at the Institut Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Piaget has come up with a ratio of 46% non-socialized talk, juxtaposed monologue. But Musho, in a Hamburg kindergarten, found only 30%. This could be due to a difference in the system of education. The children in Piaget's center had been raised according to the Montessori method, while those in Hamburg were largely accustomed to a life in groups. David Katz, in his observations, has counted 150 quasi-familiar conversations of his children, 5 years, 3.5 years, and he has directed true discussions, indications of curiosity, of feelings, etc., in their conversations with adults. He has noticed an actual activation of speech, going far beyond Piaget's conception of egocentric language. Therefore, one must be weary of all artificial divisions into successive stages. It appears that from the beginning, all the possibilities are inscribed in the expressive manifestation of the child. There is never anything absolutely new, but there are anticipations, regressions, and retentions of older elements in new forms. This development, where, on the one hand, everything is sketched out in advance, and which, on the other hand, proceeds according to discontinuously progressive series, denies intellectualist as well as empiricist theories. The Gestaltists have helped us to understand the problem better by explaining how, at decisive periods of development, the child appropriates linguistic Gestalten, general structures, neither by an intellectual effort nor by an immediate imitation. To elucidate this problem, we will consider them in turn. First, the problem of the acquisition of phonemes, to the problem of imitation. Skipping ahead slightly to the section originality of phonological analysis. The originality of phonological analysis from Jacobson comes from what they consider to be the anterior to language, in a sense, above language. Language is a system of signs linked to significations. The problem is to see the relationship between the sign and the signification. The phonologist, as such, studies the vocal elements which are already signs, but which are without designatable significations. Phonemes by themselves do not mean anything. They only serve to distinguish one word from another. The phonologist brackets off the acquired language. He tries to rediscover the sign in their originary function within the verbal chain. Short of all the conventions or all the historical events that in the end have attributed a given meaning in a given word. According to Saussure, language is a system of signs in the process of differentiating one from the other. For the word, as for the phoneme, the phonologist looks for the differentiating modalities which correspond to differences in signification. The phonologist studies the word as it refers to language, the rules of sign usage. The problem is not to find out how significations are associated apart from signs, but how phonemes articulate one another, how sounds cut off the world from meaning. The whole of phonic signs shows gesticulations, movements in the world of the signified. Language has a function analogous to language of a new writer who at first is not understood, but who little by little becomes understandable by teaching people how to understand him. His gestures seem to point in non-existent directions. Then, little by little, some notion begins to find for themselves a potential virtual home in these gestures. In the same way, language ends up by coming alive for the child. At a certain moment, the whole set of indications which draw towards an undetermined goal call up in the child a concentration and a re-assimilation of meaning. The internal structure of the language carries with it its signification. Language is a system of a limited number of unities, serving to express an unlimited number of things. There is therefore a going beyond of the signifier towards the signified. The totality of meaning is never fully rendered. There is an immense mass of implications, even in the most explicit of languages, or rather, nothing is ever completely expressed. Nothing exempts the subject who is listening from taking the initiative of giving an interpretation. Trubetskoy shows that phonemes are not atoms. He is not concerned with studying the phenomena in themselves, as he is with understanding the distinction between them. Words in relation to phonemes can be compared to melodies in relation to tones. They are modulations of a phonemic system. Language, he goes on to say, is a screen utilized by all who use this language. For example, the Russian-speaking German transforms the German according to the structures of the Russian phonemic system, whereas phonetics is the study of sounds as they are reproduced from the outside. Phonology is an effort to return to the immanent reason by which sounds organize themselves in a language. At the same time that phonology studies phonemes, it also studies all the distinctive signs of a language: prosodic relations, accentuations, language that count syllables, and those that do not count them. Language has a threefold function. First, a representative function, then an expressive function, finally, a function of appealing to other people. Phonology studies values, the values of sound whose validity is determined according to these three relationships. The phoneme is neither a physical reality nor a psychological reality, but a value with an abstract and fictive importance comparable to that of money. Phonemes render the existence of a language possible. How can a child acquire a phonemic system? Jakobson tries to explain the child's appropriation of the phonemic system and how, for the child, the self-sufficiency of isolated and unrelated sensations transforms itself into a conceptual distribution of these same elements. A conceptual distribution would be produced in the child's mind. That is, he would understand and would start again with vocal phenomena that originally were uncoordinated. The phonemic system has to be reinvented by the child, just as it had been invented by the group. In reality, Jakobson compromises what is original in the phonological analysis by treating the phonemic system as a conceptual system. He himself compares the acquisition of this phonemic system to the acquisition of a system of colors. Now, progress in the perception of colors is not a matter of intellectual analysis. It is an articulation of a Gestaltung of perceptions themselves. Similarly, the acquisition of the phonemic system cannot result in an intellectual classification. The child assumes the range of phonemes which are immanent to the language he hears, in the same way that he assumes the structure of the perceived world. Conclusion. Jakobson's interpretation would be acceptable if language had only a representational function, but we have stated, along with Buhler, that language is indissolubly representation, self-expression, and appeal to others. The child's movement towards speech is a constant appeal to others. The child recognizes in the other another one of himself. Language is the means of affecting reciprocity with the other. This is a question of a vital operation and not only an intellectual act. The representative function is an aspect of the total act by which we enter into communication with others. One can sum up in the notion of style What is newest in the phonological analysis? The phonemic system is a style of language. The style is defined neither by words nor by ideas. It possesses not a direct signification, but an oblique one. It permits one to characterize the phonemic system of a language just as it permits one to characterize a writer. The phenomena of imitation. After the acquisition of phonemic system and of the first words, we say that the child develops his language by imitation. We will study the problem of imitation in general before applying it to language acquisition. First, the classical conception. The problem of imitation will be the following. After having seen a gesture or a word, how is a child able to take this gesture or word as a model and to reproduce an equivalent gesture or word? This seems to presuppose a twofold process. In order to translate a visual behavior into a motor language, one must first understand what stimulates the behavior of others and then to reproduce it. In reality, this double translation does not exist. It is impossible for a child to return to the motivating and muscular causes of gestures in others and then to reproduce these conditions. We have already seen that the phonemic system is never acquired by this double movement from effect to cause and cause to effect. As we understand it, the phonemic system is like a register of scales for the child. Consequently, that which the child hears and reproduces is not a perceptual performance, but a particular usage which is determined by the surrounding phonetic possibilities. If it is truly a question of scales, the child reproduces them without analyzing them. Analysis is a task which comes much later. Hence, imitation cannot be this task of double translation. 2. The problem of imitation according to Gilliam. In his thesis on imitation, Gilliam goes beyond the classical conception. He begins with a decisive remark. Before making a movement, we do not represent this movement to ourselves. We do not envision the muscular contractions necessary for effecting it. The preliminary representation of the movement that facilitates its imitation is a pathological symptom in certain cases of paresis, for example. Rather, there is a certain attraction exercised by the object, the goal that we fix for ourselves. We represent for ourselves not the movement towards an object, but the desired object itself. Similarly to speak, we do not represent the sentence to ourselves before pronouncing it. It is either the words of the interlocutor or our own words that call up what follows. Furthermore, even if one wanted to represent the succession of one's movements to oneself, it would be impossible. Consciousness is unaware of the adjustments of muscles. This is especially true of the child who is totally ignorant of anatomy. Since we are incapable of representing to ourselves our own movements, how could we represent to ourselves the movements of someone else? We will presume, therefore, that from now on, imitation of oneself, repetition, or of others is founded on something besides the representation of movement. However, what is the intermediary between the perception that we have of ourselves and the visual perception of others, if it is not this representation of movement? Classical psychology has placed us in the presence of a relation with 4 elements, of which 2 are lacking, i.e., visual perception of ourselves and kinesthetic perception of others. It tries to show how we make up for them. As for visual perception of others, Gilliam has a very simple experiment showing how lacunary it is. He draws several signs on his child's neck. The child succeeds in reproducing them correctly. But when traced on his forehead, the child reproduces the mirror image of them. The classical interpretation of imitation presupposes my analysis of the motivating conditions of other people's gestures and founds itself on a preliminary identification of their attitudes and of mine. Gilliam proposes to invert the problem. That which is a preliminary condition for classical psychologists is a mere consequence for him. Instead of saying that the identification of the other's body with mine produces imitation through their twofold kinesthetic and visual aspects, Gilliam says that the child first imitates the results of the action by using his own means and thereby finds himself producing the same movements as those of the model. The third term beyond myself and others will be the external world, the objects that are indicated by the action of others as my own. A profound and fertile idea arises. At first, we have consciousness not of our own body, but of others. There is a quasi-ignorance of the modalities of action, but the body moves towards things. Imitation is only understood as an encounter of two actions around the same object. The imitation is not an act like others, but to obtain the same result as others. At 9 months and 21 months, Gilliam's child seized the pencil upside down and used it to hit the table, but after several tries, he turned the pencil over so as to place the point on the paper. This was not a question of the child reproducing the gesticulation of his father, but rather a question of obtaining the same result as he, i.e., the position of the pencil in relation to the paper. Several weeks later, the child uses the pencil no longer for hitting the table, but for tracing lines on the paper. There again, he was imitating not his father's gesture, but rather the results. It is the same situation for all the actions which a child sees accomplished around him, to which his gesture bears only the approximate and imperfect resemblance. This means that the imitation is immanent. It aims at the global result and not the detail of the gesture. The imitation of gesture arises only little by little from this behavior oriented towards things. This is the case, for example, when children and even dogs that are accustomed to their master turn to look in the same direction as the adult. In this behavior, there was perhaps originally the fact that the adult's look fell on something interesting. But soon the parallelism between the two actions become separated from their goal, and the child systematically looked in the same direction as the adult. In this case, this imitation cannot be explained by kinesthetic imitation. When the child turns his head in the same direction as the adult, his movement is different from that of the adult in view of their different positions in relation to the same object. It seems impossible that the child could be making the transposition. The phenomena can be explained if we acknowledge that, for the child, the adult's look indicates a goal that he adopts in turn. In short, one makes use of his own body not as a mass of sensations doubled by a kinesthetic image, but as a way of systematically going towards objects. And so far as the look is concerned, it is a way of inspecting objects. Imitation can be explained to the extent that other people utilize the same means as we do in order to obtain the same goals. It cannot be explained otherwise. Gilliam indicates that imitation is founded on a community of goals, or of objects. It is from this imitation of results that subsequently the imitation of others becomes possible. Little by little, the adult becomes the most imposing element in the world, the measure of all things. He represents for children their most essential self. Consequently, by partial imitation, the child takes up the particular representation on his own. These partial imitations are a sign that he recognizes other people and himself. Other people are the universal intermediary between the world and the child. There is a contrast between voluntary imitation at the beginning and the explicit imitation later. Gilliam observes a child of 9 months who knows how to brush his own hair and that of others with a hairbrush. But 20 days later, the same child is unable to imitate the gesture of lifting his hand to his head without a brush. He is still unreceptive to non-concrete and aimless gestures. Gilliam also observes a child of 32 months who has been asked to imitate the movement of turning his eyes from one side to the other. The child begins by turning his head. The fact effectively proves that the child is imitating the results and not the means by which the model obtains these results. As we are accustomed to understand it, imitation, that is, to intentionally sketch out a gesture of one's own body, is a delayed function. It places in question not the objects, but rather a sign, an expression of the object. In imitation, other people are first considered not as body, but as behavior. The application to language. Vocal imitation is a particular case of imitation in general, but it has the advantage of being precisely controlled by hearing. One is always witness to his own speech. As far as the imitation of speech is concerned, one finds himself in possession of a double kinesthetic gift, which is lacking in the imitation of gestures. This gives a false simplicity to the problem of language acquisition through imitation, while in reality the problem is precisely as we have posed it for imitation in general. It is still the imitation of articulatory gesture that is in question. We can note that the child reproduces new sounds by assimilating them to those that he has already spoken. Here, too, imitation signifies carrying oneself by one's own means towards a goal, heard speech. The child imitates as he goes along, not by following the model point by point, but by carrying himself toward a goal result, global result. Section C, the imitation of other people. Jumping ahead to the third part, the analysis of affective imitation. What is of interest in imitation is that it is oriented much more towards other people than towards actions. The imitation of sentiments, emotions, etc., is practically as precocious as that of acts. Thus, imitation constitutes a kind of stumbling block for Gilliam's theory, and analysis permits him to correct his conceptions somewhat. For if it is true that both are equally precocious, then the imitation of acts ought to involve a human component instead of an interest in an object alone. There exists in the child a concern for the feeling of other people. It is not a question of a contagiousness of emotions, the invasion of other people's emotions, which one can also find in animals. Here it is a kind of egocentric sympathy, the child's participation in the sentiments of others. It is never an irresistible participation. It occupies the child fully for an instant, but he detaches himself just as quickly, with a kind of indifference that astonishes the adult. The true sympathy is not this contagiousness. It is rather a momentary enlarging of his own life. It consists of living for a moment in other people, and not only in living the same thing as others for his own benefit. Thus, when the child sees the maid being punished, he cries and seeks refuge beside her. It is himself that the child pities. True sympathy is a momentary investment in others to the point of encompassing others. The child will have to pass from primitive sympathy to real sympathy by a movement analogous to that which carries him from the imitation of acts or results to imitation per se, that is, to the imitation of men. For Gilliam, this passage occurs in play. This is the function by which child and parent exchange roles for the first time. The child changes perspective. By the act, he learns to distinguish other people from himself. Gilliam cites the Scandinavian author Finn Borgesson, who had published a book on imitative intelligence in 1913. The central idea is that of accommodation, which allows true imitation. When one partially imitates the behavior of others, one is obliged by a kind of induction to take on the total attitude corresponding to the behavior. For example, one automatically takes on the voice of the person whose gesture one is imitating. When one adopts an aspect of other people's behavior, the totality of consciousness takes on the style of the person who is being imitated. In other words, true imitation permeates beyond conscious limits and becomes global. Once it has been accommodated, imitation supersedes itself. It is a kind of superseding, dépassement, that permits the appropriation of new structures and, for example, the acquisition of language. In his thesis on imitation, Gilliam makes use of two very important notions, but he refuses to analyze them further. They are, one, the notion of a pre-self, or a latent ego, which remains in ignorance of itself because it has not yet encountered in others a limit to the self. According to Gilliam, this notion remains inaccessible to analysis because of the undifferentiation appropriate to this stage of development of consciousness. 2, the movement that carries the child towards others and allows him to pass from the imitation of acts to the imitation of persons. Gilliam explains this passage only as a transfer, an associationist notion that transforms this displacement into an illusion. One cannot avoid the analysis of these notions, which imply the whole problem of other people, the relation with others, as Gilliam conceives it in imitation, presumes a quasi-magical relation with our own body and the acts of others, which are perceived by us as melodic totalities, to the extent that we have the same capacities. There are the notions of phenomenology of Husserl and Scheler has tried to submit this to a philosophical elucidation, the problem of the other's existence according to Husserl. A. Posing the problem. The apparent impossibility of having a conception of others. The Cartesian cogito poses the problem of self and other in terms that seem to render a solution impossible. In effect, if the mind or the self were to define itself by its contact with itself, how could the representation of other people be possible? The self only has significations insofar as it is a consciousness of self. Everything can be doubted by him except for the fact that he thinks. Everything can be doubted except for the fact that he sees, etc. All experience presupposes contact with oneself. All knowledge is possible by this primary knowledge. All people will be a self which appears to me from without. This is contradictory. It is repugnant to the other, by definition, to be only the consciousness that I have of him, since he is for himself, what I am for me. And for this reason, I cannot have access to him, since others are not for me what they are for themselves. I have no experience of others. Even if I wanted, by a kind of spiritual sacrifice, to renounce my cogito in order to posit that of others, it would still be from me that he would have this existence, and by which he would still be my phenomena. The relationship between self and other appears therefore to be a relationship of reciprocal exclusion, and the problem appears to be unsolvable. Second section, existence of the phenomena of other people. The phenomena of other people, however, is unchallengeable. A large number of our attitudes and behaviors are understandable only as a function of others. We have experience of other people, even if it is not certain that it is according to the manner of our experience of others. As Husserl said, a certain solipsism is insurmountable. The problem is therefore that one must posit others, which seems logically impossible, since for all practical purposes other people do exist. The solution: to transform this relation of exclusion into a living relation. The givens of the problem are: one must admit a certain presence of others, but an indirect presence, since the only indubitable presence is myself, a requirement of the cogito. Husserl seeks a number of ways to attain the perception of others. First, lateral perception. Other people exist in front of me in the fashion of objects, but they always imply a certain orientation, a reference in relation to me. He is the alter ego, a kind of reflection for me. It is not a question of conceiving of a series of for itself, but a community of alter egos existing for each other. Others take their existence, in a certain sense, from me. Second, lacunary perception. We perceive other people in relation to ourselves simultaneously as a reflection and as a lack. In effect, it is like a forbidden zone in our experience. It is precisely a question of a real perception of other people in the sense of unchangeable experience. Others are present in person, but it is not the same kind of perception that we have of objects. As far as objects are concerned, that which is not actually given to me could always exist as such virtually from another point of view, in the microscope, etc. As far as other people are concerned, it will always be impossible for us to perceive them in their totality in the same way in which they perceive themselves. There is a limit to presence in the flesh. We never occupy exactly the same place as others. By definition, if we were in their place, we would be them. The distinction between our position, hic, and theirs, illic. In considering both lateral perception and lacunary perception, we have not really posited other people. I must go beyond truly penetrating their field if I want to fully affirm the existence of others. Section 3. Perception of other people's behavior. Here, Husserl's analysis is completely parallel to that of Gilliam. When I witness the setting in of the behavior of others, my body becomes a means of understanding them. My corporeality becomes a comprehending power of their corporeality. I regain the final meaning of other people's behavior because my body is capable of achieving the same goals. There, the notion of style intervenes, because the style of my gesture and the gesture of others is the same. This amounts to the fact that what is true for me is also true for others. Style is not a concept, an idea. It is a manner that I apprehend and that then imitate, even if I am unable to define it. Section 4, intentional transfer. The operation of conceiving other people's existence is more than a perception of their style. It must be like a pairing, a body encountering its counterpart in another body, which itself realizes its own intention and suggests new intentions to the self. The perception of others is the assumption of one's organism by another. Husserl gives a number of names of this vital operation which gives us the experience of others while transcending their own self. He calls it intentional transfer or apperceptive transfer, while always insisting on the fact that it is not a logical operation that is in question, but rather a vital one. The behavior of others confirms to my own intentions to such an extent and designates a behavior which has so much meaning for him that it is as though I assume it. 3. Husserl's position. To what extent does Husserl find a solution to the problem of the existence of other people in the context of an intuitive philosophy? There is, as we have said, and as he has said, a fundamental contradiction. The existence of other people is given to us, but we cannot posit it logically. It is a question of rendering explicit the existence of other people. This seems impossible, given the primordial condition which Husserl does not intend to abandon, and which, on the contrary, he calls each time we believe him to be on the verge of a solution. This condition is the Cartesian conception of the cogito. The experience of others ought to be conceived as another self, without the alter ego. Husserl states, there is no other organism. In that way, he defines the pseudo-solution that would consist of accepting the existence of other people's consciousness as beginning with my own and as verifying the analogy between our behaviors. There is conflict here with Descartes' dichotomy between extension and thought. How can we relate one to the other? This is the problem of relating the order of the in itself to the order of the for itself. The other is for itself that appears to me in things through a body. Hence, in the in itself. To conceive of this passage, one would have to elaborate a mixed notion, which would be unthinkable for Descartes. Husserl also refused to supersede the constitutive contradiction in the perception of other people. I cannot allow myself to be reduced to the image that other people have of me. Thus, since I'm not successful in positing myself from the perspective of other people, neither can I pretend to posit other people from my own perspective. Having shown the impossibility of surmounting this contradiction and the impossibility of a synthesis, Husserl adds that this synthesis is not what is needed, and that the problem is poorly posed. The difference between my point of view and the point of view of others only exists after we have experienced other people. It is a consequence, as he states, we must not posit this distinction at the outset and then oppose it to every conception of the experience of others. But with this remark, it seems that Husserl wants to reject the idea that one attains the existence of others by starting with the consciousness of self. He seems to be orienting himself in another direction. Thus, there are two tendencies in this work. First, the attempt to gain access to others by starting with the cogito, with the sphere of ownness. Second, the denial of this problem and the orientation towards intersubjectivity, that is, the possibility of starting without positing the primordial cogito, starting with a consciousness which is neither self nor others. But while Envisaging this second possibility, Husserl effectively shows that even though it would be satisfactory, it does not hide the difficulties of the problem which remain intact for him. Thus, at the frontier of the intersubjective conception, Husserl finally maintains an integral transcendental subjectivity. Later, Husserl was even more conscious of the problem and came to the point of affirming the two requirements simultaneously. For example, he says in his unpublished writings that transcendental subjectivity is intersubjectivity. The experience that other people have of me validly teaches me that which I am. But he is not able to reconcile the two. Max Scheler's view. Scheler, a student of Husserl, tries to find a solution to the problem and to secure the perception of others by completely renouncing the cogito from the start. That is, by abandoning the Cartesian postulate that consciousness is primarily self-consciousness. He begins explicitly with the total undifferentiation between self and other. He generalizes the notion of inner perception, the perception of feeling, for example, which applies as much to other people as to oneself. On the other hand, the perception of my own body or of my own behavior is as external as and no more immediate than the perception of objects. On the other hand, we perceive the feelings of others, not only their expression. We perceive them with the same certitude as our own feelings. The differences between the diverse feelings are provided by the perception itself. For example, it is impossible to confuse in other people the redness of shame with that of anger, heated arousal, etc. Perception takes us a long way into the comprehension of other people. There is the perception of the will of others as well. Sometimes we even perceive it as our own will, etc. It would be necessary to speak of a current of undifferentiated psychic experience, a mixture of self and others, primitive consciousness in a kind of generality, a state of permanent hysteria in the sense of an indistinctness between that which is lived and that which is only imagined, between self and others. How does the consciousness of self emerge from this indistinctness? Scheler says that one has a consciousness of self only through expression, acts, reactions, etc. One takes on consciousness of self as he does of others, in the same way that intentions are only known once they are realized. Thus, consciousness of self cannot be given a privileged position. It is impossible without consciousness of others. It is of the same variety. Like all experience, the experience of self exists only as a figure against a background. Perception of others is like the ground from which perception of self separates itself. We see ourselves through the intermediary of others. But a problem remains. For Husserl, the problem is to go from consciousness of self to that of others. For Scheler's view, it is a question of understanding how the consciousness of self and others can arise from a background of primitive indistinctness. Section 5. Discussion of Scheler. For Max Scheler, consciousness is inseparable from its expression. Consequently, it is inseparable from the cultural whole of its milieu. There is no radical difference between consciousness of self and consciousness of other people. But does that make it clear how the subject comes to posit other people? How is there an isolation and a plurality of consciousnesses? To this, Scheler answers, consciousnesses are only separate through their corporeality, through the whole set of instruments that they use. Corporeality is, in a way, the sensible matter that assists in the apprehension of oneself or of others, but the purely sensible aspect of a feeling constitutes only a minor portion of it. All the rest, its content, its intention, can be shared with other people. Thus, in a fire, only the subject who is burned can feel the sensible sharpness of the pain. But everything that the burn represents, the menace of fire, the danger for the well-being of the body, the signification of the pain, can be communicated to other people and felt by other people. It is therefore the same form, the same contact which is lived through another channel. Signification, the intuition of the feeling, that which constitutes its essentials, is the same for the two consciousnesses. There is an isolation of the felt, but not an isolation of consciousness. Shaler introduces the notion of emotional evidence. One cannot become the other really, but one can become him intentionally. One can reach others through all the expressive manifestations by which they give themselves to us. There is no split in our consciousness of other people. The perception of the manifestations of others involves a hypothesis about their consciousness by analogy with our own consciousness, which produces similar manifestations. With others, as with ourselves, consciousness and its manifestations are one. Husserl had posed the problem in terms of consciousness. That is what renders it unsolvable. Shaler tried to pose the problem in terms of individuality. Shaler's essential contribution is the notion of expression. There is no consciousness behind the manifestations. These manifestations are inherent in consciousness. They are consciousness. It is because other people are completely whole in their manifestations that I can posit them by their very existence and not by analogical reasoning. So, as to render the consciousness of other people possible, Shaler minimizes consciousness of self. He reduces it to a simple contact with oneself. This contact realizes itself little by little through experience and is never achieved. It never becomes a full possession of self. In this conception, the cogito takes on an importance that is generalizable, applicable to others as well as to oneself. The cogito, in the Cartesian sense, is undeniably a conquest of culture. Since it has given rise to a coming to consciousness, it is not primordial. Since it was subordinated to a whole series of cultural conditions that permitted this coming to consciousness of self, as with all consciousness, it appears under the guise of expression. With Husserl, there was already a tendency to revise the notion of the cogito, the incarnation of the self in its expressions. This tendency clashed with the definition of a pure consciousness. With Shaler, consciousness is opaque, completely invested in its expressions, but is not a coming to consciousness of self and of others as alter egos rendered impossible in this way? Does he not equate consciousness of self with that of others on the level of a neutral psychism which is neither one nor the other? Even with the introduction of emotional evidence, we know only behaviors and not persons. In pain, for example, one does not perceive other people as long as one does not represent to himself their material and sensible pain. The intentional element of the feeling is only a generality in relation to the true feeling. One does not have a real existence of other people as long as one has not linked the significations of feeling to a very fact of living these significations. Shaler's view skirts a kind of panpsychism, at the heart of which there is no individuation of consciousness. How can a subject who will not be a consciousness of self, in the Husserlian sense of the term, emerge as the subject of this common stream? Conclusions. In minimizing consciousness of self, Shaler equally compromises consciousness of others. Husserl, on the contrary, wanting to retain the originality of the ego, cannot introduce other people except as destroyers of this ego. With Husserl, as with Shaler, the ego and other people are linked by the same dialectical relation. While they seem to exclude one another, they are bizarrely allied. In the end, it is impossible to save one at the expense of the other. Both vary in the same sense. Hence, to solve the problem, one must not eliminate the initial opposition. Theoretically, it is insurmountable. However, since it is not a logical relation but an existential one, the self can rejoin other people by rendering the lived experience more profound. The self must become bound up with a certain situation. We must link the very notion of ipseity to that of situation. The ego ought to be defined as identical with the act in which it projects itself. The self and others are consciousness of one another in a common situation. It is in this sense that we must clarify Shaler's view and Husserl's notion of pairing. At issue is an encounter within the same orientation. But at the same time, there is no possibility of understanding except in the present, a kind of geometrical locus for the self and others, and in an assignable reality. When Malraux says, "One dies alone, therefore one lives alone," he is making a false deduction. Life, in fact, radically surpasses individualities, and it is impossible to judge it in relation to death, which is an individual failure. As we have seen, the conception of consciousness in Shaler's perspective, and even in certain passages of Husserl, refers us to expression, which is considered as the very act by which consciousness is realized. It seems that we have thus accomplished a kind of circle. In order to understand the acquisition of language, we have studied imitation only to discover, following Gilliam, that imitation is not preceded by a coming to consciousness of other people and an identification with them. It is, on the contrary, the act by which identification with other people is produced. This has brought us to inquire what consciousness of oneself and of others who accomplish this act might be. It is in this fashion that we have found ourselves led back to the notion of expression. But in fact, this notion is no longer exactly the one which we started. It has been enriched, and at the outset, we considered language as an intellectual operation of deciphering other people's thoughts and as an intermediary between the person who speaks and he who listens. But according to this conception, the subject who learns to speak can only find the concepts that he already possesses in language. Language can add nothing new, since it presupposes thought. However, experience shows that language has as much influence on thought as the inverse. The classical notion of language, therefore, cannot account for the learning of language. On the contrary, in the light of Husserl's and Shaler's conceptions, we no longer consider language acquisition as the intellectual operation of constructing meaning. We are no longer in the presence of two entities, expression and meaning, the second of which might be hidden behind the first. As a phenomenon of expression, language is constructive of consciousness. From this perspective, to learn to speak is to coexist more and more with the environment. Living in this environment incites the child to recapture language and thought for his own means. Thus, Acquisition no longer resembles the decoding of a text for which one possesses the code and key. Rather, it is a deciphering, where the decipherer does not know the key to the code. The decipherer keeps himself in two converging ways. First, by an internal critique of the text, frequently of certain signs that their arrangement, words, or if there are any, that is, their structure. Two, by an external criticism, place and time of the writing, situation of the writer. It is a fact that up till now, texts of all types have been deciphered. There is always an intuitive element that intervenes in this operation, since the givens of the problem never suffice to determine it logically. It is a creative operation, comparable to the learning of a language by the child, in the sense that at a given moment, the decipherer, like the child, ought to go beyond the given elements in order to grasp the significance of the whole. This is the moment in which the totality of signs, the style of the text, can no longer mean anything but one single thing, whereas Jakobson said about a phonemic system, it tends towards signification. Between the period when the child does not understand the instant when he does understand, there is a discontinuity that is impossible to overlook. Classical psychology, in affirming that thought precedes expression, tries to cover up this gap, but by the same token, it takes away all the meaning of the phenomenon. In fact, just as the child learns to know himself through others, he learns to know others through himself. He also learns to speak because the surrounding language calls up his thought, because he is enticed by its style until a single meaning emerges from the whole. This is why Abridged could call language a semiological gesticulation, which is to say that the meaning is immanent to living speech, as it is immanent to the gestures by which we point out objects. It is necessary to compare this process to Wolff's research concerning the apprehension of individual style. Wolff shows photographs of different people to subjects who have never been initiated into scientific disciplines. He presents them with signatures, silhouettes, and the recorded voices of the same people, and he asks them to match up all the materials. The proportion of correct matches, about 70%, is amazing, without the subjects being able to indicate what guided them in their selection. We must admit that perception of other people grasps a unique structure in which all their expressions, voices, writing, etc., participate. Wolff, therefore, gives evidence for the existence of fluent, non-thematic signification. Arising from signification of this variety, language is pregnant for the child when he hears it used around him. Hazy at first, the signification articulates itself and becomes more and more precise. It is not a question of a phenomena on the level of pure thought or understanding. It is the value of use that defines language. Instrumental usage precedes signification per se. It does not occur otherwise, even at the level of the most elaborate language. For example, in the introduction of a new concept in philosophical language, it is according to his own usage that the author forces the acceptance of the sense in which he uses a new term. The signification that he proposes is therefore an open signification, without which there would be no acquisition on the level of thought. An entirely defined language, an algorithm like that of logical positivism, would be sterile. Up to now, we have considered language acquisition only in terms of the child's first words the child has acquired. the means of designating objects in their absence, but only objects that can offer themselves to sensible experience have been considered. The same problem again poses itself on the level of thoughts, when it has been resolved at the level of the sensible. This is what Piaget calls the developmental lag, i.e., all that is acquired at a certain level must be started over again at a higher level. As far as the child's egocentrism is concerned, it will have been surpassed long ago on the level of perception by the time that the child has to surpass it again on the intellectual and logical plane. Moreover, even for the adult, the expression of what is most personal is the experience, in his experience, will always have to be perfected. It is in this sense that Malraux could say of his Psychology of Art, how many years does an artist need before he finally speaks in his own voice? Far from being limited to the first years, language acquisition is coextensive with the very existence of language.